Lecture number 11 of Renaissance literature. My name is Fawzi Slisli. Today we will be talking about the Cavalier poets. It's a tradition of poetry that flourished in the late 16th and early 17th century in England and contributed a great deal to the poetic tradition that provided social criticism, social description, described the social classes, the relationship between the classes, described the scenery, the nature, and gives us a huge insight not only into the linguistic and poetic production of the Renaissance, but also into the social and political dimension of the time. So the Cavalier poets are usually said to include people like Robert Herring, Richard Lovelace, Sir John Suckling, Thomas Carew. They take their name from the term used to describe those who supported the royalist cause in the English Civil War. So these were people, these were poets who supported the king during the English Civil War, and they became known as the Cavalier poets. They share their belief, the central belief that they share collectively is their loyalty to the king, and are generally royalist in their sympathy. They participated in the royal idealization of the relationship between Charles I and Henrietta Maria. This was a relationship that the monarchy itself was promoting as romantic and beautiful, as a mythology to attract the population with, and they participated, the Cavalier poets participated in spreading this mythology and in participating in it with poems. They composed poems which celebrated Platonic as well as sensual love of the kind the royal couple expressed, and loyal devotion to the beloved ruler. Other shared values that they had included a prizing of friendship. Friendship was very important to them, hospitality, and a commitment to the classical concept of the good life as expressed mostly by Horace, the Roman Latin poet. These poets, the Cavalier poets, made the idea of the good life central to their poetry, as well as loyalty to the king and so on. Many of these values and the neoclassical poetic style with which they are associated were inherited from Ben Jonson. So the central figure to which these poets see themselves in lineage to, as if they were poetic sons. Actually, they call themselves sons of Ben, and so Ben Jonson as a father figure, as a poetic intellectual father figure. So Ben Jonson is some kind of a poetic father figure to the Cavalier poets, and in the tradition of Ben Jonson, central to it was the neoclassical style, which is associated with the rules of poetic and stylistic production associated with Roman and Latin poets, especially Horace, Seneca, and Cicero, praising, eloquence, and so on. So these poets, the Cavalier poets, follow Ben Jonson in respecting the neoclassical tradition, neoclassical rules, and classical poets and writers like Cicero, Horace, Seneca, and so on. Alongside the flourishing of religious lyric and new types of love lyric, the early 17th century also witnessed a fashion for various forms of occasional poetry and encomiastic verse, which is poetry of praise. There is a lot of poetry of praise in the Renaissance. What we call in Arabic al-madh. So there is a lot of encomiastic verse. This is poetry of praise, such as verse epistles praising individuals, epithalamiums or wedding poems, epitaphs, and elegies. So these all flourished during the early 17th century. In similar fashion, a number of early 17th century poets wrote poems which celebrated particular places and buildings, specific houses, specific countryside locations, and so on. Probably the most famous of these are the so-called country house poems, the country house poems, which became popular following the publication of Amelia Lanier's, her poem called The Description of Cookham. This poem established the tradition of the country house poem. And Ben Jonson's To Panthurst, which was written in 1616. So these two poems, Amelia Lanier's and Ben Jonson's, The Description of Cookham, and Ben Jonson's To Panthurst, established this genre, this tradition of poetry that describes specific homes or houses in the countryside and the owner and so on. Ben Jonson established this tradition. This tradition traces its lineage to Ben Jonson. And this Johnsonian tradition was broadly that of social verse, meaning it's a verse for social consumption, for society, for social weddings, functions, parties, and so on, to read and hear and discuss. It was written with a classical clarity and weight. It means it respected classical rules and deeply informed by ideals of civilized reasonableness, right? Civilized reasonableness. There is an ethos of civilized behavior, civilized decorum, and civilized conduct. And Ben Jonson's poems made a great deal about respecting these civilized norms and promoted them in society and praised people who respected them and who taught them and spread them and promoted them. It also celebrates ceremonious respect, respect that people pay in a ceremonious fashion to, upper class people, to the lords, to the queens, to the kings, to the princes, and so on, in a ceremonious fashion. An inner self-sufficiency. They also praised an inner self-sufficiency, which is usually associated with Stoicism. It's the inner self-sufficiency, the feeling of contentment, to reject greed, to reject excesses in happiness, in everything, and to be satisfied with inner self-sufficiency. And it's usually traced to the Roman Latin poet Seneca. It is a poetry of publicly shared values and norms. So this in general is the tradition of Jonson, the Johnsonian tradition. It's respect for the Latin classical tradition, it's respect for the kings and princes and queens and so on. It's promotion of the ceremonial respects, and it's promotion of civilized, reasonable codes and conduct. Ben Jonson's own verse was occasional. It means it was specific to specific occasions. It addresses other individuals, it distributes blame or praise, and it promulgates, declares serious ethical attitudes. His favorite forms were the ode, the elegy, the satire, the epistle, and the epigram. And they are always beautifully crafted objects, achieving a classical harmony and monumentality. For Jonson, the unornamented style meant not only colloquiality but labor, restraint, and control. Again, Senecan values of self-control. A good poet had first to be a good man, and his verses lead his society towards an ethic of gracious and responsible living that respects the hierarchies in society, and so on. The Cavalier poets who succeeded Johnson basically brought an element of urbanity and conviviality, pleasant and social life into discussion. They promoted the idea of pleasant sociability, right? Social respect between classes, between society, between people, conviviality, urbanity, respect, good manners, and so on. The Cavalier poets were writing England's first verse about the society, lyrics of compliments and casual liaisons, often cynical, occasionally sensual. So this was the first tradition of English verse that looked at the English society and gave us a wealth of information about the English society, its complexity, its social mores, its social habits, and so on and so forth. The Cavalier poets were writing England's first verse about society. That's basically what it means. Let us look for a minute to an example of these poems by the Cavalier poets. We're going to look at Robert Herrick, a famous Cavalier poet, and his poem Upon Julia's Clothes. Upon Julia's Clothes. He says, "Whenas in silks my Julia goes, then methinks how sweetly flows that liquefaction of her clothes. Next, when I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration each way free, oh, how that glittering taketh me." So they're short poems, they're smart and witty and intelligent, and usually describe some observations or express love or describe some aspect of society. The poem Upon Julia's Clothes was written in 1648, so it's the middle of the 17th century. It's a response to a dress worn by an imaginary woman called Julia. The poet likes the flowing, liquid effect of the silk dress. So it's a silk dress that flows and looks like it's liquid. The woman appears to be attractive when she wears this style, but the emphasis is on the look of the clothes. In the second stanza, Henrik praises the shiny fluttering of the dress. He claims to be very attracted to the effect it creates. Robert Herrick's Upon Julia's Clothes is a brief but popular poem that often appears in anthologies. It's 6 lines, that's all it has, just 6 lines, offer a masterful imagery with the unity of purpose, rhythm, and rhyme that combine to elevate its common subject matter above its proper station. So here is a common everyday life, a subject matter, and he takes it and by having a unity of purpose between rhyme, rhythm, and the unity of purpose creates a poem that actually raises above its station. The speaker begins, "When as in silks my Julia goes," and Herrick adds repetition in the next line, then methinks how sweetly flows. So the repetition of then methinks how sweetly flows. The parenthetical remarks, methinks, between parentheses, gives a touch of realism to the sentiment, while the flow of Herrick's words imitates that of the silk he describes. So in a way, his words, the flow of his words, try to imitate the flow of the dress as it moves, basically. The noun in the third line representing the height of sensuality as the speaker describes what flows so sweetly, that liquefaction of her clothes. So the clothes look as if they are water, liquid. Herrick uses the scientific term liquefaction in the poem And it evokes a contrast and emphasizes the grace the silks require to appear like a liquid, organic skin that flows about Julia's body. The final triplet, the last 3 lines, is the expression of a man reveling in woman's beauty. As Herrick writes, he says, "Next, I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration each way free, oh how that glittering take me." As far as the imagery and style used in the poem, first there is an element of imagery. The poem is built around an image of a woman named Julia wearing a free-flowing silk dress. He probably picked the name Julia to fit in with the picture of the flowing dress. There is the use of a metaphor. The movement of the dress is compared to flowing liquid, flowing water. Liquefaction. It also glitters or shines like jewels, right? So these are metaphors. There is the use of a paradox, which is an apparent contradiction. Silk is a solid material and is compared to something liquid. That is a contradiction, an apparent contradiction. It's a paradox. There is assonance in the poem. Notice the musical effect of vowel repetitions in the 2nd and 4th line, where the E sound is repeated. Consonants also, there is a repetition of consonant sounds anywhere in the word. The 6 L sounds of the first stanza emphasize the flowing of liquid movement of the silk dress. And this brings us to the end of this lecture on the Cavalier poets of England and their description of various social functions and social mores and social habits in England. I hope you find it useful. Until our next meeting, I bid you assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa ta'ala wa barakatuh. رقم 2.